Hello, everyone. This is a lecture on constitutionalism and absolutism in Europe. Um, so let's get right to it. Or should I say absolutism and constitutionalism in Europe. These are two ideologies we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how they develop in different countries. Absolutism on continental Europe and constitutionalism in England, but also in the Netherlands. But just a little background to what's going on during this time period. With Europe, we're entered an age of exploration already. That is, European explorers have taken to the oceans and traveled across oceans, the Atlantic Ocean in particular, to get to North and South America. Remember, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But also other explorers explored the coast of Africa and went around Africa and into Asia. Initially, the two countries involved in exploration, this age of exploration, were Spain and Portugal. Spain, even though Columbus was Italian, he sailed for Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. And Portugal as well followed Spain. Portugal mainly explores the coast of Africa and moves into Asia. So if you notice North America, or at least South America, Spanish is the dominant language, but the Portuguese also went into what is modern day Brazil, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese. After the success of Spain and Portugal, other European countries got involved in the age of exploration, mainly England, France, and the Netherlands. Thus, English is the dominant language in the United States. Remember, Louisiana had a French influence. There's a part of Canada called Quebec, where they speak French. So they're very prominent. Another thing going on at this time is Europe is divided religiously. So it's not just divided into different countries, it's divided religiously. At one point, the Catholic Church, with the Pope as head of the church, was the dominated Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, there's something known as the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. But in the West, it was the Catholic Church, with the Pope in Rome in charge of all Catholics in Western Europe. But Martin Luther, a German priest, came along by the name of Martin Luther, who challenged the authority of the Pope, broke away from Rome, and established his own Christian denomination. That's an event we call the Protestant Reformation. And the word Protestant is simply a word used to distinguish Christians who are not Catholic. It doesn't apply to all Christian denominations, but for the most part, a Protestant is a non-Catholic Christian. And so we see the development of a number of different Christian denominations. Lutherans in the German states, Anglicans, those are in England, Calvinists, they're spread out all over. The Calvinists founded by John Calvin, Anabaptists, and a host of other different denominations, just like today. In the United States, we have something like 400 different Protestant denominations. Now, unfortunately for Europe, these new religious denominations, these new versions of Christians, didn't particularly care for each other. There's no such thing as religious toleration at that time. So once you get the Protestant Reformation, these new religious groups forming, you see a lot of religiously motivated warfare as different religious groups fight each other. Lutherans fight Catholics, Calvinists fight Catholics. They all fight each other. Protestants fight each other. Lutherans and Calvinists don't get along. So you see a century of religious warfare. Another thing going on at this time when we look at Europe is there is a social hierarchy. Europeans are grouped into different social groups based on privilege. At the top of many European countries sits a monarch, a king, or a queen. Mainly kings, though, but queens sometimes rule. A monarch and the royal family. Right next to them are the nobility, the aristocracy, the nobles, the aristocracy. They're the same. They have privileges based on birth. If you're born into a noble family, you have special rights under the law. For one, you are often exempted from taxation. Just next to the nobility and prominence within this hierarchy, at the top of the hierarchy, are the clergy. Those are church officials, and they have a hierarchy within the church as well. You've got the Pope at the top, you've got archbishops and bishops. That is, there are social ranks within the clergy. One thing I didn't mention about nobles. Nobles are the men and women of title. These are the dukes and duchesses and counts and countesses. These are men who have titles in their names, women as well who have titles. They're born into that, they inherit those titles. Now we'll also see at this time period the rise of a sort of middle class businessmen or merchants. And these are people who can become incredibly wealthy. Some of them want to move up in society, so they pay kings a lot of money to get a title of nobility and to get that privileged status. So merchants, they're the middle classes or the middling orders. These are the businessmen, a different group, but many of them are rich. At the bottom of society, you see a lot of different groups that we lump together as peasants. Some are artisans, that is, they're skilled. Some have a bit of farmland, the independent farmers, it's not much. Some really have very little land, and some are even tenant farmers. That's at the bottom of the side. And at the bottom of society are the laborers and servants. And when I mean servants, we're going to see a return of something known as serfdom, S-E-R-F for serf. A serf is kind of like a slave. These are peasants who are essentially owned by someone else. The labor is owned by someone else. At times, they're going to be bought and sold. Families are going to be broken up. So in Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, we're going to see a return of serfdom. There's a picture of the peasants, happy peasants on a farm. And aspects of life during this time period, if you had to guess what people did centuries ago, well, they tried to survive. Life is precarious. We're looking at an average lifespan of maybe around 30 years of age. It's often lower. And one of the reasons why the lifespan is low is because there's an incredible infant mortality rate, high infant mortality rate. Lots of babies die in their first year of life. Remember, we don't have modern medicine at that time. So life is very difficult. And people are susceptible to weather changes. You know, there's a little ice age that occurs in the 17th century, that is the 1600s. So it's colder and wetter means the growing season is shorter. And obviously crops need water, but if it rains too much, that destroys and damages crops. So there's less to eat. You're more likely to starve. And when you're starving and when food is scarce, your immune system's weaker, and you're more susceptible to various diseases and bacteria and viruses that are, some of which are very deadly. So it's a struggle to survive, and there are often famines. There are times of when people have plenty to eat, but there are often times when they just don't. And there are economic problems that arise from that. There are revolts and rebellions, particularly from women, when the price of bread gets too much because the grain harvest was too low, and so inflation occurs. So let's look at some of these things in a little more greater detail. One is the religious warfare. There are religious wars in the German states, religious wars in France, in the Netherlands. The last of these religious wars is the 30 Years' War. As you know, the title is accurate, the last 30 years. And it's a warfare between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire is something we call German states. It's about what sort of religion is going to be accepted as valid for people to worship. And there are also nationalistic issues involved, where the French and the Austrians and some of the German states fight it out to see. Sweden gets involved to see if they get to dominate this region. So there are religious issues and political issues involved. It's incredibly bloody. Some areas, as I have on here, lose 40% of the population during this war. Imagine that happening in the United States. 40% of, say, Louisiana is gone in, say, a 30-year period. That would be devastating for some of these regions. It's going to end in 1648 when countries are just exhausted. They're tired of fighting, and they're tired of all these religious differences causing problems, particularly rulers. Rulers don't like instability. So there's a Peace of Westphalia. In the German states, this weird thing in Central Europe with independent German states, independent German territories, where almost 300 princes are in charge, they gained some independence. And at the Peace of Westphalia, it's decided that the ruler of a region gets to determine the religion of that region. So if you are a ruler of Brandenburg, a ruler of Prussia, you get to decide that all the people that live within Prussia or Brandenburg or Bavaria or something will be a particular religion, the religion you choose. And if you're the ruler of Bavaria, you're likely to be Catholic, so all Bavarians are going to be Catholic. If you're the ruler of Prussia, you're likely to be Lutheran, so all of your people are going to be Lutheran, sometimes Calvinist. But Calvinism is added as well as one of the appropriate religions that's acceptable. So that's going to come to an end. And you can see, I talked about the Holy Roman Empire. Here is the Holy Roman Empire, if you see me scrolling over it. It's in the center of Europe. There's no country called Germany, but this is where all the Germans live. There's no country called Germany until 1871. We're going to get to that a lot later. That is, Germany becomes a nation much later than other countries. You can see France is over here. France is going to define this as absolutism. England's right here. We're going to see England become Great Britain, which includes England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales is over here. That's going to take a little time. We'll talk about that. Spain is down here. Portugal is going to gain independence from Spain. But like there is no Germany there, there's also no Italy. Yeah, Italy is right here, the boot, with a bunch of Italians there. But there's no country called Italy. They're divided into independent territories and even a region called the Papal States that the Pope rules. So one of the things going on at this time is the development of absolutism. A king who rules absolutely. That is, kings get to make laws. You know, it's a slow process. They get to make laws and they get to enforce those laws. It's a slow process for this to happen. One of the things kings like to do is raise an army, particularly a large army. That's how you exert your control over your own people in your own country, not just fight in wars, but you control people in your own country, especially when you use armies, standing armies, as security forces and police forces. How do you raise armies? You got to raise taxes. You got to get money. Kings are out for prestige, so they get involved in colonization. It's something they can brag about. Plus, there are new markets for some of your products and new natural resources, and you're competing with other countries for the glory of having colonies abroad. Some problems in state building or building a centralized state where the king controls the country. There's great diversity in a lot of these countries. If you're from one of the northern German states, you speak a version of German that's different from Southern Germans. You won't understand what they're saying. Same thing in France. France actually has hundreds of different languages spoken at that time. It takes a while for someone to come along and say, this is the official version of French, for instance. These are the rules of grammar. And all of you people who speak a different version of French or some other language altogether need to learn this. That's later on when you get a school system where you can really promote linguistic unity. There's incredible diversity. And plus it takes a long while to travel from one part of the country to another. If it rains, you get stuck in the mud. You can't move. So it could take months before you can get somewhere. So just some of those things are problems with kings face who want to control a region. Local rulers in some areas are powerful. We even have parts of the world today that are ruled by warlords that have central governments, but some regions, parts of the country are ruled by warlords today. You know, parts of Pakistan, for instance, or Afghanistan, instead of that are out of reach of the central government. So that's one of the things kings have to worry about. So they raise taxes, build armies, build a powerful bureaucracy, and try to take control over their subjects. It takes a while. They create a legal system, a royal legal system, to impose justice, their version of justice. And that's what they try to do. They all build up these armies. Powerful countries want to build up these armies. And the rise of absolutism is tied to the creation of large, powerful armies. We'll see that the French have the largest army in Europe, particularly under King Louis XIV, which is why the rest of Europe often has to unite to go to war with France. At this time as well, Britain is not going to have the largest army. It's going to have a good army, but it's going to have the world's largest navy. And there's a picture of the Swedes. The professionalization of the military occurs where you have ranks and you have drill. They learn strategy. They learn the art of war. They train as a professional group. But again, some other things that lead to problems with kings exerting their authorities. If there is a problem economically, if there are bad harvests, if people feel like they're paying too many taxes, one of the things people do, they rebel. They rebel against rulers. It's not odd for people in whatever country, whatever part of the world, to have a popular rebellion or a revolt, cause some insurrection, and cause some problems for kings. This is why kings have armies. They can send in the military to control some of these regions. Doesn't always work well, but they do that. Now let's look at the development of absolutism. Absolutism is an ideology, and we're going to see some ideologies later in this class, like fascism, Nazism, communism, even democracy is an ideology, where absolutists believe that all power should be vested in a king who rules by divine right. So you're not supposed to question the king. That is, the kings are people who are chosen by God. Now, if we wanted to figure out what's the highest authority, we can use to justify our rule. We're not going to say, well, some guy on Bourbon Street said I should be king, so I'm king. No, I'm king because God put me on the throne. God likes me. He chose me to rule over this land. This is an age when people are very, very religious. So when you appeal to God, people tend to follow and believe you. So anyway, we see this process of absolutism occurring under a guy by the name of Henry IV, who becomes king after a civil war, a religious war in France called the War of the Three Henrys, because three people named Henry decided they wanted to be king. He wins. He's actually a Protestant. 90% of France is Catholic, 10% is Protestant. French Protestants are primarily Calvinists, and they're called Huguenots. So one of the things he does after becoming king is he converts to Catholicism because it's the majority religion of his people. So he converts to Catholicism to sort of gain some acceptance. He also decides to improve the transportation system in France. He also decides to lower taxes. And for a while, he's quite popular. He does something. He was once a Protestant. He does something to give Protestants some ability to worship. That is, he passes something known as the Edict of Nantes, which grants religious freedom and religious toleration to a limited degree to Protestants, to allow them to worship freely in some parts of France. It's not full religious toleration. They're only allowed to worship in some areas of France, not just everywhere. What happens to Henry? Well, a radical Catholic murders him in 1610. He wasn't happy with the acceptance of Protestants. And his son, Louis XIII, takes over, who's just a boy, and boys can't rule. So he has an advisor who runs France in his place as the first minister of Louis XIII. And that advisor is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu is the advisor. He's the first minister. And his goal, even though he's a cardinal, he's a high church official. Cardinals, for instance, get to elect the new popes. His goal is to make the monarchy of France all powerful within France. And his goal is to make France the dominant power in Europe. He wants to subordinate everything to the French monarchy. Even he wants control over other Catholics. He gets involved in wars against the Austrians, who are also Catholic, because he wants France to be all powerful. He is a French Catholic. He is a nationalistic Catholic. And that's his goal. And to increase power in France, he declares war against the Protestants. He attacks Protestant strongholds. And he sends royal officials all over France to collect taxes and to pass new laws, to hold courts. These royal officials are called intendants in France. He's going to be followed by another boy king, Louis XIV. Louis XIII, once he came of age, he wasn't really terribly concerned about running France. He just liked being a king. And after he dies, he has a boy king who replaces him, Louis XIV, who as a child is also going to have a chief minister, another cardinal. France is a Catholic country, and this is Cardinal Jules Mazarin, who runs France until Louis XIV comes of age. Cardinal Mazarin, one of the things that Cardinal Mazarin does is he causes these sort of mini civil wars, these insurrections within France over raising taxes. The nobility rebel against Mazarin's tax policy. They don't want to pay taxes, so they rebel. At one point, a number of nobles actually stormed into Versailles Palace, this great chateau where the French kings lived. So during this rebellion, Louis XIV is sitting there as a boy king, seeing French nobles attack essentially this symbol of monarchy. And he vows never again to let that happen. And once he comes of age, he is the king who establishes this whole idea of absolute monarchy. He is really the first true absolute monarch in France. And he is defined by this notion of absolutism. So everything before him is sort of a prelude. He becomes king. He's his own king. He doesn't rule with a first minister that he lets take charge. He rules France. He's an advocate of divine right and monarchy. And even kings, by the way, they are answerable to God. So if they misbehave, they're going to go to hell, according to this idea. God's going to punish them. So even within this concept of a divine right of kings, they have to rule in an appropriate manner. They don't always do that, but that's the idea. They're supposed to. So here's Louis. There's this body called the Estates General of the different groups in France. He never calls. He doesn't want to rely on that. Instead, in order to control powerful nobles, many of whom have their own armies, he enlists the aid of the middle class. He sells some titles of nobility to the middle class, and he uses them in their bureaucracy. He revokes the Edict of Nantes, this sort of limited toleration for Protestants. He's Catholic. He wants all the French to be Catholic. A couple 100,000 French actually leave France at that time period. They don't want to convert to Catholicism. There's a picture of Louis XIV. Look at those stockings and shoes he's got. But anyway, Versailles. Versailles is the seat of his government. He lives at Versailles. It's a marvelous chateau, the most expensive, most beautiful chateau palace at that time in Europe. And other Europeans look at it and say, I need one of these. I want to build one of these, which is very expensive. And one of the ways he uses Versailles is to control the nobility. He makes nobles leave their homes, wherever they are in France, and come meet and stay at Versailles at their own expense, and to learn all the elaborate rituals. Now, it's his presence that the nobles admire. He's a great king. And you know how a lot of people might admire certain figures. There are people who look up to presidents that way. Certain presidents is just amazing for who they were, or even vice presidents as amazing figures. So they want to be associated with, or celebrities. Oh, I want to hang out with a celebrity rather than having lunch with my neighbor, something like that. You know, that hanging out with a celebrity or a president will that'll look better on Instagram than me just talking to a neighbor. You know, that sort of thing. So people like to have that status of being associated with important people. And who's more important in France than the king? So the nobles go there. It's very expensive. And while they're there, they're not paying attention to what's going on at home. The king's got his royal officials in these areas throughout France, imposing law, taking control for the king. And the nobles are at Versailles learning all these elaborate rituals. You know, for instance, you're not supposed to knock on the door to enter. You've got to scratch on the door. And if you don't scratch on the door, if you violate one of these rituals, then you're not going to sit at the dinner table next to the king. You're not going to be invited to the music that's going to be performed that night, or something like that. So they're all concerned with learning how to be a social nobility, where they learn rules of etiquette and behavior, the proper way to speak, the proper way to dress, the proper way to behave, so that they can associate themselves with the greatness that is Louis XIV. And that during this time, French culture is the culture of Europe. The elites of Europe, the nobles of Europe, the kings of Europe, they want to speak French. They want their own Versailles. They want to act like the French. They want to eat French food, those sorts of things. So French is the dominant language of Europe at this time in diplomacy and statesmanship. And there's a picture of Versailles. It's really a marvelous palace. If you get a chance, go over there. And there are people at Versailles, some of the gatherings there. The gardens at Versailles are really impressive, but it's a huge, huge complex about 10 or so miles outside of France. Now, the king does have ministers, one of whom is his economic minister, a guy by the name of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who is an advocate of mercantilism. This is an economic policy that supports the erection of tariffs, that is, taxes on imported items, so that the French don't have to pay to bring in any goods from abroad. Mercantilism supports something known as a favorable balance of trade. What they want is more trade from France to other countries and very little trade coming in from other countries, very few products. That is, instead of spending French money on goods, giving someone else, some other country, your money, keep your gold and silver in your own country, develop your own products, develop your own industry, so that you don't spend money abroad. The problem is a lot of these mercantilists, some of the economy, you know, some products just aren't as good that are built in France that they have abroad. And the money that's saved from some of this, Louis is going to spend on a lot of his wars. Louis is also an advocate of colonization. Where do we get the word Louisiana from? You know, you may have heard of Jacques Marquette, Louis Joliet. He sends a few thousand French to settle in the New World in North America. But as I said, Louis has lots and lots of wars. He always goes to war. He wants to take additional territory during his wars, but he's never really that successful. He tries to fight the Dutch, go to war against the Netherlands. Doesn't work out so well. He goes to war in Spain to try to control the monarchy of Spain, something known as the War of the Spanish Succession. It lasts well over a decade. But one of the things that happens with all these wars is they're very, very expensive and they're not very successful. Warfare is expensive. He wanted to increase the size of France dramatically. He's not able to do it if you look at this slide. Only gains a little bit of territory. Now let's look at absolutism in Central and Eastern Europe. It's a bit different the way it develops in Central. First of all, I see this slide is about Spain. A couple of things quickly about Spain, absolutism in Spain. Spain is a declining country. Spain was once the dominant power in Europe during the age of exploration. Now Spain is going bankrupt. They spend money like crazy. Spanish kings got involved in so many wars, and there's less and less money coming from the New World. They have to deal with a series of revolts, one of which creates an independent Portugal in 1688, and it just does not go well for the Spanish. So they're in decline. Now let's look at absolutism in Austria and Prussia. One of the things that happens in Central Europe, we're going to look at 3 places, Russia as well, Austria and Prussia in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. Serfdom returns, that is, free peasants become unfree serfs. They're tied to the land, no freedom of movement. They're bought and sold as kings make a deal with the nobility, giving the nobility control over the serfs in return for service. So they work with the nobility rather than the middle class. Austria is kind of interesting. Austria was the country that first started the 30 Years' War. Austria, they defeat the rebellion that occurred in Bohemia. Later, they defeat a revolt among Hungarian nobles, although the Hungarians do get some independence, but I'm not terribly interested about Austria right now. Let's look at Prussia. Prussia is one of the interesting territories within the Holy Roman Empire, one of the interesting states. It is Prussia. It is a German state. This is not Russia. It has a P in it. It's a part of Germany. It's where Germans live. And the ruler of Prussia has the title Elector. The nobles in Prussia are called Junkers, and this is the territory that ultimately leads the drive to create a united Germany. It takes a couple of centuries for that to happen, but they ultimately do that. That is, the rulers of Prussia co-opt the nobles. Instead of fighting the nobles, they co-opt the nobles. That is, in return for taxation, the nobles say, okay, give us control over the serfs, and we'll pay our taxes. We'll serve in the military. And the Junkers are going to be the officer corps of the Prussian army. And even in times of World War II, a Prussian aristocrat has a von in the name. So Otto von Bismarck, you can see some of the German generals with a von in the name, like Frederick I, like von Manstein or somebody, if you study World War II military history. But over time, the rulers of Prussia get the title king, and being a king is much better than being an elector. And here you can see Prussia. Prussia is going to unite with this region called Brandenburg, get the title king, and it's this little region, Prussia, that's going to ultimately conquer the German states, Prussia. The first real legitimate king of Prussia is a guy by the name of Frederick William I. He's called the Soldiers' King because everything in Prussia is subordinate to the development of the army and a bureaucracy that manages Prussia. And he gets the best army in Europe during his rule. It goes through strict, severe training, brutal training. It is a militarized state, but it's not a state that goes to war. He just builds up a powerful army. Now, it's a small territory that in terms of its size, it's not that large, but it is, man for man, the best army in Europe. A special unit of that military are the Potsdam Giants. He liked having tall soldiers. There's one of them there. Russia. Russia is another territory that becomes an absolute monarchy. Russia for a while was ruled by Mongols, Asian rulers who worked with the princes of Moscow, these Russian officials called the princes of Moscow, to help them manage Russian affairs. Over time, the princes of Moscow gain their independence, they fight off Mongol rule, and they take the title of Tsar. Tsar means emperor, it means Caesar. That's the Russian word for Caesar, Tsar. And these czars, who were once princes of Moscow, work with the Orthodox Christian church to establish their rule. I mean, when you support the church, you support an institution that ordinary Russians who are hoping to get to heaven support as well. So they will like you. One of these powerful rulers is a guy by Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible killed his own kids. he goes to war against the Mongols and others. He fights this group known as the Cossacks. These are wild bands of roaming peasants and others just on the outskirts of the Russian frontier, who sometimes invade and attack and then flee. So Ivan the Terrible, he's a powerful figure. After his death, though, there's the period of instability known as the Times of Troubles, where the nobles rise up against the czars. The nobles sort of seize control of some territories. Czars tend to be weak at that time. There are also Cossack rebellions and peasant rebellions as well that occur. So it's a time of trouble, a period of turmoil and violence where it's not a pleasant time to be alive. And there you can see sort of the Russian state right there. That's going to change under an individual by the name of Peter the Great. Peter of Russia, Peter the Great. He's the Tsar of Russia. He retakes control of Russia. He's a powerful figure. He goes to war against the Swedes who were also powerful at that time, in something known as the Great Northern War that he wins. He builds a new capital at St. Petersburg, and he undertakes an age of modernization and westernization. He believes Russia's backwards. So he adopts a lot of Western ideas, particularly as they relate to the military and to government. He is a giant of a man at that time. He's about 6'10", and he travels to the West to figure out how the Prussians drill their infantry. He goes to the Netherlands and England to see how they build ships so Russia can have a better navy. So he tries to learn the best of what the West is doing and bring that into Russia. He also adopts some Western cultural attitudes. For instance, the openness of women. Women in Western Europe were allowed to talk and meet and greet others in public and in their homes. In Russia, women tended to be secluded within the household. If a guest came to the house, women went to a special room so they couldn't be seen or heard. He begins to change that. So opening up a little more freedom for women, certainly not full equality, not even close. He also changes some cultural attitudes. The Russian nobles often wore long beards to signify their devotion to the Orthodox Church. He noticed in Western Europe, they didn't wear beards. So he'd cut their beards. He'd teach them new manners, new ways to sit at a dinner table, to eat a meal. That is, he wants a more refined culture. So he wants westernization of his military and his bureaucracy, but he also believes that some cultural changes have to occur. They have to adopt some Western cultural attitudes in order for Russia to become a major power. And there's Peter the Great. There he is cutting the beards of the nobles. And we will stop right here for this lecture. And I'll pick up a little later with another lecture.